maybe that's like a good point to look at our next issue on the agenda tonight, and that of NHI, because I think there's perhaps a connection between the two, and that is the issue of ideology versus human suffering. You know, in the case of NHI, there's a sort of an ideology which is driving it, and then there's the question about the reality. Maybe if you could just share your views, SRF views, on the current NHI bill, and what does it say, and what are your concerns, and do you think this is a reality? Is this going to happen? And how do things look in this area? Because that's the other big concern. As I'm here, I'm really here to just give the voice to the questions I'm hearing in the community. And after load shedding and electricity, the next thing that people are talking about a lot is NHI.
Yeah, National Health Insurance, that's NHI. That's a policy proposal. It's been around in South Africa for the better part of 15 years. And the proposal is chiefly motivated by ideology, is to ensure that all people in South Africa have access to the same healthcare resources, an equitable division of resources. And for the original drafters of the policy, the motivation was that it is unfair that some people are able to make use of our absolutely brilliant world-class private healthcare system, while other people are forced to make use of the public system, which is often in poor state of repair and service isn't very good. The way that message has sometimes been interpreted in business is that NHI is there to ensure world-class standards of healthcare for all South Africans. Now, that's a strategic mistake, because that, I assure you, was not the motivation of the original crafters of this policy. And in business, sometimes the argument's been made, look, you can't really do this because there's not enough money to enable world-class access for all South Africans. The original drafters of the policy would say that doesn't worry us, because we're not after that. We want to ensure the best quality of equal healthcare access to all South Africans within whatever limited resources are available. So even if it's not as good as what the private sector was, that's fine, as long as it's equitable and the same for everybody. If the proposal, as it's currently drafted in policy, is implemented and executed, what will ultimately happen is that the state will be the single point that purchases all healthcare services in the country. And it will, in the fullness of time, nationalize private medical schemes and incorporate their resources into a single pot of funds from which those healthcare products or services are made available. And regardless of who you are and where you find yourself in the country, you will be able to, in theory, visit any care provider, and that care provider will provide services to you free and will then claim back from the state. So that's the idea behind the policy. It's advanced very far over the past 15 years and has recently gotten through some, not final, but some very important parliamentary and sort of legislative process milestones. If the policy is implemented in the fullness of time, as it is currently drafted, it will cause immense damage to South Africa, because the country will not be able to sustain its middle class, because if you can't sustain a middle class in the absence of world-class healthcare services. And the middle class will exit, and the capital and skills exit on the back of that, and the sentiment slump will do very great damage. You cannot underestimate the seriousness of this. You don't lightly use terms like failed states. You're throwing around too much on South Africa at the moment as it is, and we're not a failed state. But this would tempt such a definitional threshold. However, there are a few things to say to calm immediate fears. One is that the private medical industry is quite correct in stating, as it has done in its defense at length in the past month, that we are still far away from final implementation. That is true. We are a long way away, and we have a great deal of time before that happens. The second reason, and I don't like being hopeful, but the second strategic consideration is that if you assemble 400 politicians into a parliament and leave them unchecked to do what they do, in Brussels, you've got thousands of lawyers and accountants crammed into a few city blocks. And they sit there regulating Europe, which is why Europe got as far as regulating the curvature of a banana, because that was what they do. If you leave lawmakers, policymakers, and politicians to make laws and policies, and you don't challenge them, the process gets a momentum all of its own. And I think to an extent that is what has happened with national health insurance. And it's got as far as it's gotten because it hasn't faced serious and coordinated resistance, not for its own sake, but to create the pressure to slow the policy process and then develop very compelling alternatives, which the private medical industry has in abundance, such as a low-fee medical aid scheme. It's just one, and partnerships with the public sector to increase quality of services and a whole host of things. To move the policy process off the current destructive track onto a track that will see South Africa maintain its standing as a provider of world-class private healthcare. And that is the anchor that a lot of the fixed investment and capital resources and skills resources in the country depends on. We can retain that and use that at the same time to aid the state in improving the quality of healthcare systems broadly. Now, if you want to do this, you need to understand something about the ANC, which has always been true of it, certainly through its sort of modern age, which dates to the aftermath of the Second World War. If you want to get somewhere with the ANC, you need to develop a relationship where it understands that you are prepared to take a stand in defense of interests or policies or ideas or principles that are important to you. If you indulge its worst instincts or seek to go along with it, to get along with it, as the mining industry did here for 20 years, or seek to appease it, or seek to be nice to it in the face of policies that will clearly do damage, you tempt a situation where it cannot help but to bully you further and move further and further down that policy track. If, on the other hand, you take a firm, well-argued, well-resourced position to say that this policy is so at odds with our best interests and those of the country that we are prepared to oppose it firmly, the ANC will initially probe your sincerity, will test you, see if you're going to back down, perhaps threaten something or becomes a bit cross. If it sees that you are prepared to stand your ground and that you have broad backing around you to do that, it will change and it will begin to negotiate. And the reason for this is not guesswork or happenstance or any of those things. But deep within the makeup of the ANC is a very sound understanding of revolutionary ideology, which business leaders and relative elites and many political leaders in the Western world no longer have, because the Cold War ended 30 years ago and they've forgotten. And what that revolutionary ideology says, and it's quite true, is you can advance the revolution against the private healthcare sector in this case if you meet with no resistance. But as soon as resistance is encountered, you must stop. And if the resistance is sincere, you must even reverse your position to lull your opponent into a false sense of security. And the reason is the nature of the revolution for the ANC is not one of nationalizing the means of production and the state taking over. The South African state would never entertain going mining in its own right, as many empty mines are sort of lay about the place. Its objective rather is to harness the private sector and its resources to the revolutionary agenda of the state, to slowly and incrementally apply those resources, often under the management still of the private sector initially. And if you frighten the horses and inadvertently build up a body of resistance to your revolutionary ambition, that is no longer possible. And precedent for this is widespread. I worked for 2 years on a project to stop expropriation without compensation. And that followed the aggressive adoption of that idea in 2018. And that project was very successful in that it killed the explicit notion, stone dead, within 2 years by following this kind of strategy. There are still risks on expropriation, serious ones. There's a dangerous piece of expropriation legislation. But speaking with actually a surprising amount of experience of doing this over time, this is a strategy that works every time. And
go ahead. Sorry, finish that point. Yeah.
If this nature of strategy, it's not a hostile strategy, it's not aggressive, you don't call the government a bunch of delinquents. You merely understand that all political activity is about forcing a balance of power. And if you can force a balance of power around the question of NHI now and build up a public opposition and resistance, you will stop the process and reverse it. And once you've reversed it sufficiently, you can actually introduce a new positive process that brings about much better healthcare access to all South Africans while maintaining the excellence of the private sector. And this is virtually assured. And when you do that, I mean, my experience over the years was often that there were leaders within the South African government who were grateful that this had happened. Because the ANC is not the kind of organization that likes tall poppies. You don't stand up at an executive meeting in the face of the manifestation of the will of the party and say, well, I, as the individual, I think this is nuts. But when an outside force comes in and forces you to a standstill, there are many serious and pragmatic individuals in and around the ANC and the present government who would be grateful to use that opposition as an excuse to stop the dangerous drift of this policy and supplant it with something more constructive.
I think that the point that I wanted just to mention in this context, we were talking about the moral issue of NHI, and of course there is an imperative that every human being is entitled to proper health care at the highest possible levels. But what was so interesting, I saw in the main editorial of the City Press on Sunday, was this notion that actually, everyone agrees with the objective, but this is not the method to achieve it, because ultimately the reason for the failure of healthcare in the public sector is not because of lack of resource. It's a budget which I think by international standards is a very high percentage of the budget, and there's enough money inside government healthcare to ensure world-class service delivery. That is not the problem. The problem is in the implementation and the execution of it. So exactly how would this solve the problem of the suffering on the ground? And that's why I think this issue of it's human suffering versus ideology, because I heard that the private medical aids had put forward a proposal to government to say that for between a mere 150 to 300 Rand a month, they would provide health insurance to every South African that would give them access to private health care. And that was rejected by the government, to the point where now the private health insurance industry is actually taking the government on review on this matter. But I mean, is that not the absurdity of it, that this is not about the morality of helping poor people with proper health care, because there are many solutions to that. And actually, the outline of the solution is to use the brilliant private health care and make that accessible to more and more South Africans. And here was a perfect opportunity to do that, and the government turned it down.
No, you're right. What we spend on health as a share of GDP, we should have far better outcomes. If you doubt or ask why would the state do this, and you doubt my explanation of ideology and my secondary explanation of looting the resources within private medical schemes. So as the South African state started to run out of money, as the deficit grew after 2008, we did see signs of a pivot away from looting public resources to looking into the deep pools of private capital that exist and seeing whether these could be applied, as I say, not applied to the revolutionary agenda of the state as a precursor to their eventual nationalization. So those are the primary. If you challenge that and say, well, you don't think it's ideological, you don't think it's looting, you think it's a sincere attempt at improving healthcare services. If that were so, walk into a typical government hospital or clinic, or read the horror stories. A government that deeply cared about the standards of healthcare its people receive would not be administering hundreds of facilities that are as truly awful as much of South Africa's public healthcare infrastructure. You're right on low-fee medical aid schemes. These are a wonderful innovation, but they, for technical reasons, I don't think we should go into tonight. It is not possible at this stage for an insurer to provide cheap, low-fee medical aid to an individual who wished to purchase that at this level of, I don't know what the entry point is. I think it's about 250, 300 Rand a month. So that's very possible. And the upshot therefore for me on NHI is it is as dangerous in the fullness of time as it's described. But at this time, we have more than enough time to build up the body of constructive opposition to ensure that the policy is not implemented as drafted, but is replaced instead by something very much more pragmatic. And it is encouraging. It's again encouraging. I think you referred to an editorial piece in City Press this past weekend. Very critical. We've seen that in other parts of the media. We've seen various civil society and civil rights groups saying they will oppose this in public, overseas, in the courts. We've seen groups of medical specialists. One I paid particular attention to was in Natal, saying we're not going to accept this because this threatens our livelihoods and futures. You've seen healthcare policy people say one of the great dangers in this is that even if the government doesn't do it in the 5 or 10 years ahead of the point where it might do it, you will do such damage to investment in private healthcare and to South Africa's ability to retain already a problem, the healthcare professionals we train, that quite frankly, by the point you decide to do this or not to do it, a lot of the damage will already be baked into the South African equation. So the resistance to that is building very successfully. And if it continues to build, my expectation is, and it wins the support of the industry broadly, my expectation is that in that case, it will be seen off. But if that resistance collapses or is undermined or was a sort of flash in the pan and dies away, then the question of NHI does remain a sort of existential risk to South Africa's survival as a free and open society.
But your assessment, looking at sort of the media, I think even organized business, BUSA and others, as civil society, all of the current noise and trends within the opposition, which is just beginning, does that sort of indicate that this opposition will eventually reach the critical mass that will defeat us, in your opinion?
You must do exactly that with analysts, what you're doing with me. Say, get off the fence and make a call. And 3 months ago, I told you load shedding would lessen, and it did. On NHI, I expect that the body of resistance will continue to build. And in that event, I expect that we will see off this threat over the next 3 to 4 years and eliminate the threat and replace it with a much more constructive body of healthcare policy. There's the call.
Yeah, but I think thank you for making the call, but I think it's also a call to action for all members of civil society and business to step into this. And I think that it's actually in the interests of every South African. This is not about class warfare. This is actually in the interest of protecting against human suffering on vast scale here. Perhaps
don't say what can I do? I'm just a little guy. What can I do? You can do a lot. You can write a letter to your chief rabbi. If the chief rabbi gets enough of those letters, he gets a mandate. And you put pressure. He acts on this in your interests to an extreme degree, I assure you. It allows him to just to stay with him. He's here, so it makes sense. Allows him to build up a body of support in the broader religious community. You can write your medical aid scheme and say, listen, you've invested in the scheme. It's now at risk because it is. What is your plan to oppose it? You can join and support the broad cross-section of civil rights groups that are gearing up and some already far advanced in their opposition to this. And that is the difference. If large numbers of individuals learn how to use the agency they have, even in small ways, to oppose counterproductive policy, if you have a position of any influence in your community or in your business, do the same. It is that kind of action. I remember once we had a campaign on something like this, and a chap said to us, all I can do is give you 20 rand a month, and the system we used could do that. And he said he's very sorry, but he doesn't have much money. And I actually remarked to my colleagues, I said, that guy who's gone to this length to reach out to you, actually do the 20 rand. He does more to safeguard the future of the country than very wealthy people who sit on their asses and do nothing about it because they're scared of the political implications. And you as the individual have multiplied by thousands of people around you, have vast agency to help set a constructive agenda for the country, and you must never forget that.